I want to thank Enkyo for the invitation. We had a great Dogen event in July, and we're planning one for next summer. And also Howard was very helpful in organizing this event. So what I'd like to do today is to have it be somewhat interactive. So please feel free to ask questions. And I thought for some of the poetry, I invite people to read a few, to volunteer to read a line or read the poem or suggest an interpretation as we work our way through this document. It's a long document. I'm not going to give you a quiz at the end, so don't worry about that part. And I'm not going to necessarily follow the exact order that's here. This was pulled together from a couple of other files that I had, and I may move around depending on the theme in different ways. So our basic idea for today is to consider some of Dogen's poetry, but also poetry written about Dogen or interpreting Dogen, some by Dogen, some where Dogen is reacting to other Zen poets, especially some Chinese predecessors, other kinds of Zen poetry from his era or that may have influenced him. Maybe he was reading in China, or some other Japanese poets that were responding to some of his ideas. So it's a variety of items, and you'll see that a theme that comes up on the first page of it is the idea of ambivalence about writing. And this is a main theme I want to bring out in terms of Dogen's view of Zen. So I'm going to make some introductory comments about Zen and about Dogen, and most of you are going to be familiar with a lot of these ideas, but I want to put it in a certain perspective that has been occurring to me recently. And by the way, let me just say that on a recent update, I did have two new publications this summer. One is called Readings of Dogen's Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and that's a book about Shobogenzo. And also Flowers Blooming on a Withered Tree. And that is a translation of a verse comments on the Shobogenzo that were written in 1329 by the fifth abbot of Eihei, a monk named Gyun. And that's on a special edition of the Shobogenzo known as the 60 fascicle edition. And so that some of that poetry is included in this file today. And I'm going to be working on a new book on Dogen's Chinese poetry. As some of you know, many years ago, I translated Dogen's Waka poetry, and I have a couple of examples of that. And I also included in that some of Dogen's poetry written in classical Chinese. But I've been getting more interested in the Chinese poetry in recent years, and there's a collection of 150 of Dogen's Chinese poems that was collected in the 1700s by a famous monk named Menzan, and it's called Ku Chu Gen, Mystery Within Words, or I called Wisdom Within Words. And it's so that's kind of what I'm gearing up for, and this talk is hopefully brings to light some of the ideas that I've been working on and will continue to work on. So let me put in perspective some basic thoughts about Dogen's view of language and writing poetry in relation to Zen more generally. And again, as many of you probably know, the Dogen was well aware that poetry could be a distraction and could detract from the meditative experience, and poetry was something that you had to use with caution. And in one of his books, the Shobogenzo Zui Monkey, written in the mid 1230s, it was a series of lectures in the mid 1230s. He does talk about the idea that it's kind of a waste of time, and you shouldn't get hung up on it. Now, Dogen has a lot of inconsistencies and apparent contradictions, so it's not so surprising that he would say that in one place, and then turns out that he wrote about 500 poems altogether if you add up all the Chinese and Japanese style poems in all of his collections. And he wasn't the only Zen master from that era, who, of course, who had those ambivalent thoughts about writing. So what was the point of writing? Well, one basic idea, of course, is that in the Chinese context, in the Song Dynasty, so from 960 to 1279, for those several hundred years, and Dogen goes to China towards the end of that in the 1220s. But in that whole era, part of the ascension of Zen as the kind of mainstream religion in China and then transmitted to Japan is that it appealed to intellectuals, it appealed to the scholar officials, it appealed to the literati, and many of the Zen masters interacted with secular leaders who were poets and artists and who enjoyed the wisdom they gained from their Zen colleagues. And so the I think the ambivalence that I'm referring to, we can see on page 1. And if I can ask you to scroll down a little bit, the one that says Bao Shin, yeah, that let's stop there, right there. So the one that says ambivalence meditation, or ambivalence regarding meditation, yes, early Northern Song. So deep within the temple, this, and you can see the style here, and a lot of these I have the Chinese or the pinyin. The style was was generally 4 lines. So the 4-line or the quatrain was the main poetic style that was used. The 4 lines have either 5 characters or 7 characters. 7 is more common, but this one has 5. And the lines have to have follow a lot of rhetorical rules and devices. They have to have a rhyme scheme for the final syllable. They have to have tonal patterns for the characters inside each line. They have to have certain thematic references. There's supposed to be a 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern where a theme is introduced, it's developed, it's kind of contradicted or turned around, turned topsy-turvy, and then there's a final kind of concluding remark that may or may not kind of wrap things up or refer directly to the previous content. So just keep those rules in mind when we're reading through some of these poems. But this one, I think, really speaks to the issue of the ambivalence. Deep within the temple, nobody speaks. All I hear is the sound of tall pines dripping with rain. Poetry comes about when I fall out of meditation and anxiety interferes with my peaceful repose. It's interesting that he says that the poetry inspires me when I fall out of meditation. So it implies that there's some kind of contradiction or contrast or conflict between the state of mind in meditation and what happens out of meditation, and maybe the poetic impulse breaks the concentration, and maybe it's counterproductive. But yet, here he is writing the poem about that. So, it's very, very interesting to me, and we'll see a couple of other examples where that contradiction is directly addressed. But let me bring up another idea for a moment. There's a famous Japanese folk song from the 12th century that's cited in a novel by the famous Japanese author Kawabata Yasunari, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968. And the Kawabata's novel is called The Arch Bridge, Solihashi, which refers to the Sumiyoshi Taisha Shrine in Osaka that goes back to the days of Tale of Genji, so it may predate this particular song. That's not on the page, but I'm gonna read the song from a separate document. And the song that Kawabata refers to was inspired because he grew up in Osaka. He grew up near this shrine, and the shrine has this famous, vermilion-colored arched bridge that's still there. It's been rebuilt over the years, but apparently it does go back about 1,000 years. And one of the comments Kawabata made was that when he was a kid, it was scarier to walk down the steps of the arched shrine than up the steps of the arched shrine. That's something people think about quite a bit. But he also, in this novel published in 1947, he also cites this famous folk song. And by the way, the folk song is inscribed on a stone that is in Eikando Temple, which is a Zen temple in Kyoto near the famous Nanzenji temple. Anyway, the folk song says, although the Buddha is not present, and I'm not going to try to sing it, but although the Buddha is not present, although the Buddha is ever present, although the Buddha is always present, and one interpretation would be that Buddha is eternal, because he doesn't appear right in front of our eyes. On a soundless dawn, we think it's nothing other than a dream. And, this folk song in the 12th century means it was written before Zen came to Japan 100 years later. But I think it expresses a feeling that all the Japanese Buddhist schools try to deal with, which is, well, how do you make that dream real? How do you actualize that dream? How do you bring the Buddha's presence down to earth, so to speak, or make it feel present? So I think in Zen, of course, it could be said that the twin pillars for doing that are Zazen and koans. But instead of saying koans, let's say more broadly, use of language or speaking. So, Dogen, if we think of Zazen and speaking, or sitting and speaking, or just sitting, and what I'll call for Dogen, just saying, meaning his forms of expression that are a manifestation of the meditation, rather than that conflict, although he does express ambivalence. What is the relationship between those two forms of practice? Now, I think, if you pick up a book about Zen, obviously one of the most famous passages is special transmission outside the teaching without reliance on words or letters. So, sometimes I say to my students, okay, Dogen unifies body, mind, but if you had to pick one over the other, 50.01% versus 49.99%, which would it be? Let's say they're unified, but which one does he give priority to? Now, maybe that's not a fair question, but at the same time, I think it's trying to tease out some of the ideas. It's relevant to ask that. And if we ask that question about Zazen and the use of communication, language, speaking, what Dogen calls dotoku, expressing the way, as a chapter in the Shobogenzo. I think if you pick up a typical Zen book, obviously the priority is going to be Zazen, because there's so much discussion about whether literature, writing, expressing is relevant or is a distraction. But I think basically what I want to say about Dogen is that he does try to bring these two together. So on the one hand, Zazen is kind of stillness, uprightness, steadfastness, fixedness, unswaying, unvarying, concentration. And expression can be very spontaneous and can be very erratic and very contradictory. And, you know, there's the Zen koan collections like Blue Cliff Record that refers over and over again to the idea that a true master must be able to startle the crowd. So he's got to use words and letters that kind of gets people's attention. Whether they shouldn't necessarily be attached to those words and letters, but it should stimulate them to think and rethink and to reverse the thinking and turn things upside down and topsy-turvy. And I think what Dogen is trying to do is to take Zazen and make it more than the steadfastness, because he does talk about the dignified demeanor that must be maintained in all activities. And this is something that's stressed over and over again in Shobo Genzo, that all activities are an outgrowth of the same state of mind as Zazen. So just sitting is not just sitting. Just sitting is doing all the chores and all the activities and all the discipline and the cooking and the cleaning and the washing and the wiping and the sweeping. And at the same time, the speaking or just speaking, or since he uses the term non-thinking in that famous passage about meditation, in Fukan Zazengi and several of the Shobogenzo fascicles, he emphasizes the word non-thinking. We could refer to his idea of just saying as a non-speaking, and that just speaking, just saying, or non-speaking is something that he wants to stress is absolutely vital and is going to occur anyway. So you want to cultivate it and polish it and not try to suppress it, even though he does struggle. So to look at the ambivalence, in Dogen's case, if we could, well, okay, I think we have it on the page right now. So just above the poem we read, ambivalence regarding talent, and this is by Taozi Yijing, and he was a Chinese Soto master in the late 1000s who wrote a major koan collection, who was a predecessor of you know, some of the teachers that, or the, you know, the main teacher that Dogen, Rujing, that Dogen studied with in China. And he says, though in the business of explicating emptiness, I cannot avoid being enslaved by my talents. I have been studying and practicing Zen meditation, yet somehow I remain preoccupied with literary pursuits. Again, this one has 5 characters per line. So I think the flavor here is a little bit different than the previous poem, where he says that he falls out of meditation and into and out of peaceful repose and into the writing impulse. But in a way, it's making a very similar point. Should I be concerned with literary pursuits? I should really be concerned with emptiness and meditation. But this preoccupation, you know, gets into my system. So let's look at a similar poem that Dogen says, and could I ask anybody who would like to read that one? That's the one that says Ambivalent Emotions by Dogen, just below. Yeah. Would anybody, and maybe you can, by the way, maybe Bo Gusho could, if he's aware of anybody who wants to speak, or people can chat to him if they have a question, or yeah.
Yeah, chatting would be best, because with the shared screen, I can't see everyone.
Right.
I'm seeing Roshi raise her hand, and anyone who needs to can unmute. And Roshi, would you say something if you need to?
I was just going to volunteer to read which poem?
Okay. So ambivalent emotions, living for so long.
Living for so long in this world without attachments, since giving up using paper and pen, I see flowers and hear birds without feeling much. While dwelling on this mountain, I'm embarrassed by my meager efforts.
Okay, good, thank you. I know it's hard, I don't know how easy it is to establish the interactiveness in the Zoom setting, but anybody want to interpret that or comment on that? I think that, so I guess one thing is to unmute and speak up if you want to, but let me go ahead and make some comments.
Excuse me,
So,
that would be the way, because again, the shared screen makes it
Yeah.
impossible for me as moderator to see everyone. So,
Right.
you know, chat or share or unmute and speak, please.
Okay, all right. So I'll keep speaking, and then, but please feel free to contribute if you wish. So a new element that comes in here in Dogen's poem. Now, even though the previous one we read by the monk named Taozi, you know, he was a Soto monk, it's hard to know exactly, if Dogen would have read that poem or not. So we know a lot of things that Dogen read and commented on and rewrote some of the poems, and we'll see some examples of that, but we don't know at all. So we can only imagine that he had access to these materials, but these collections of koans and poems and poetic comments on koans are vast, and so we don't know how much of it Dogen was able to get through, in his studies. But I think the poem is quite similar, and a new element is that I see the flowers and hear birds. So there's an emphasis on nature. Now, in that first one by Baoshan, he did say that he hears the sound of the tall pines dripping with the rain. So there's something similar there. But Dogen comments that I see the flowers and hear the birds without feeling much. Now, the original Chinese is quite ambiguous in just about all these phrases, and it's not exactly clear when he says without feeling much. Does he, you can't be 100% sure, but I think the ambiguity or ambivalence in the writing is part of what he's trying to get across. So does he not feel much because he is steady and indifferent and calm and composed? Or does he not feel much and kind of regrets that it has kind of a nostalgia for that feeling, because that does that feeling can contribute to awakening. Two of the stories that Dogen loves to tell over and over again is the Chinese monk Ling Yun, who gained enlightenment after struggling for 30 years by seeing peach blossoms in bloom, and another Chinese monk Sheng Yan, who had a similar story and was struggling for decades to gain enlightenment, and sweeping up a pebble struck a bamboo, and that sound of the bamboo awakened him. So he likes the idea that these momentary sensations can be quite inspiring and quite a way of stimulating the awakening experience. So when he says, I don't feel much, there's a kind of ambivalence there.
But isn't it that he, because he gave up the paper and pen, that he doesn't feel much, because he's lost that desire for expression that has silenced a quality of feeling?
That's how I see it too, is that he's so moved, yet not allowing himself to express himself, he feels unrealized in that, somehow in that regard. That's how I see it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, definitely. I agree with both those comments, that there's that layer of, I wish I could, I want to be in touch with that feeling, but I'm trying to, I don't want to say suppress or repress the feeling exactly, but in trying to overcome the world of attachments, do I lose a little bit of touch with the aesthetic impulse, the poetic inspiration, that the communion with nature? Is there a kind of trade-off there? So I think those comments are excellent comments, because I think that's a level of ambivalence that he's bringing to it that's a little bit richer, in a way, for me at least, than the other two poems, even though he's probably was inspired by them or kind of building on their attitude. And then he says, I am embarrassed by my meager efforts. So again, I think there's a kind of ambivalence here, in the sense that What's he embarrassed by? Is he embarrassed by feeling the emotion anyway, even though he's tried to give it up? Or is he embarrassed by not feeling it deeply enough because he's tried to give it up? Or is he embarrassed by the fact that he knows he's not really a great poet? And even though the Zen masters kind of had to write poetry and they had to develop the skill as much as possible because it was an expectation and a kind of requirement, you know, they would always probably compare themselves to the real poets. The real poets were longing for the true spiritual experience of the Buddhist masters, and the Buddhist masters were probably longing to cultivate their poetic ability a little bit more. So I think all those levels of uncertainty, doubt, are productively, for me, this is very productive point for Dogen. Now, if we look at when he wrote this, a lot of the poems are undated, but if we put together, you know, kind of the biographical context, this was probably written at Eihei, probably in the 1240s, the late 1240s, when he was at Eihei, and the impression that some historians of Dogen have is that he, like Chinese masters before him, would sometimes go off from the main temple area and go into his own hut, his own meditation area, an area of seclusion. He would be reclusive to some extent. Maybe the grounds where he went to, the location where he went to, was a little distance away from the main buildings at Eihei, or maybe it was nearby, but he would kind of seclude himself for periods of meditation. And a lot of the poems come out of that time period, and also the waka or the Japanese style poems. Now, if we could scroll up to the top, here I want to go to two other poems that and you may be aware of these authors. Let's start with Liu Kan. Liu Kan was a famous Soto poet and monk from late 17, early 1800s, kind of the last great traditional master before the Meiji era sets in and modernization sets in. Of course, there were a lot of great masters in the modern period, but Liu Kan was still in that kind of pre-modern traditional era. And he was a great poet in himself, and probably greater as a quote unquote poet than Dogen would be considered as a poet if we looked at it from that angle. But you know, Liu Kan was very inspired by Dogen, and he has a famous poem about Dogen's Eihei Koloku, or the extensive record collection. That when he one time he according to that poem, one night he was feeling it was pouring rain out, and he was feeling a little depressed, and he kind of reached back into his bookshelf, and lo and behold, he picks up an old copy of Eihei Koloku, and he dusts it off because he probably hasn't ever read it or hadn't read it for a while. And one of the things he comments on, he says that nobody's really read this seriously for 500 years. So he's writing a little over 500 years after Dogen's death. And he says he reads it, and he's so moved, and he stays up all night. He lights a candle, and he reads it and reads it and reads it, and he thinks back on when he had first studied Shobogenzo. And in that poem, and in some other remarks that he makes elsewhere, you know, Liu Kan says that he's the first to admit that when you read Shobogenzo at first, it's very difficult to understand Shobogenzo, and he's not sure if he understood it at that time, but he does remember that he used that Shobogenzo as an impetus to do some travels and to do some deeper study and deeper practice of Zen. And that now that he's reading Eihei Koloku some years later, he's very inspired once again, and he kind of brings those two texts together. the poem ends in a very interesting way because he spends all night reading it, and then he weeps from joy at the experience, and the book is soaked. And then the next morning, a neighbor stops by, sees the very damp book, and says, "What's going on? Why is your book so wet?" And so the Okan says, well, he was kind of embarrassed that he didn't want to admit the real reason. So he told the neighbor that the rain must have seeped in during the driving storm that they had during the night. But the Okan talking about his own poems, could we get somebody to read this one?
And again, if you want to accommodate the request, just unmute yourself and start reading. Thanks.
I can go ahead and read.
Okay, go ahead.
Why would anyone call my poems poems? My poems are not poems. Find me someone who understands my poems are not poems. So we can begin to talk about my poems. Zhuangzi's goblet words. Where is there a man of no words, so that I may have a word with him?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that the Okan would have been influenced by the Taoist idea that goes back to Zhuangzi, a couple of centuries before Common Era, of the goblet words. Where is there someone who speaks no words, so that I can speak a word with that person? And why would anyone call my poems poems? So I think he's capturing this ambivalence that he had the reputation. He knew he had the reputation for being a poet, but because his real identity was the Soto monk, he didn't want to limit the view that what he was expressing was literature in contrast to spirituality or to religion or to the Dharma. Now, the next one by the famous Sung Dynasty Chinese poet Su Shi. Let me introduce him. Many of you would be familiar with him from Dogen's fascicle Keisei Sanshoku, Sound of the Valley Streams and Colors of the Mountains, where his poem is quoted by Dogen. A different poem is quoted by Dogen, where Su Shi stays up all night, and he says that the colors of the mountains are, resemble the Buddha, and the sound of the river flowing is the long tongue of the Buddha expressing the Dharma. And in his comments, Dogen says, was Su Shi enlightened by looking at nature, or was nature where the mountains enlightened by taking into account or beholding Su Shi? I think to me that's one of Dogen's most intriguing commentaries. And then it gets into a discussion of a number of things in that fascicle. But let's consider Su Shi outside of that poem, because he was said to have written 2,700 poems, and he was also a famous artist and painter, and he also inscribed many poems into his artwork. He also wrote travel journals, and he was a real Renaissance man. He was a government official for a while. He fell out of favor with the political situation, and he was sent into exile. But for a while, he was the mayor of Hongzhi City. He also was involved in agriculture, and he invented some agriculture machinery. He was known for being an expert in cuisine, and the dishes that he favored or wrote recipes for are still used in China today. And he was quite a important figure. And he was not a Zen Buddhist, but he did spend time practicing meditation at temples, and he did interact with a lot of the Buddhist poets. So this is a classic example where you have that very creative interaction between the poets who are interested in meditation and the meditators who are interested in writing poetry, and what happens when they interact. And so Dogen was the first in Japan probably to call attention to Sushi's poetry, but in subsequent years, he became a prized figure in Japanese literary circles as well, and he influenced a lot of the other Zen poets of the era. So Sushi's poem is quite simple, but deceptively simple. Some say music lurks in the lyre. Why then is it mute when closed in its case? Some say sounds come from the fingers of the player. Why then on your fingers do we hear no music? And there's a kind of ambivalence here for Ryokan, because he doesn't want his poems to be looked at just as poems. And Susha is kind of focusing on, well, what is the inspiration? Is it the pen and paper? Is it the scroll? Is it the brush? Is it the mind? Is it the fingers? I mean, the implication is that it's a state of mind, and you can't physicalize it in either the instrument or the actual act of playing, unless you have that deeper feeling. Now, I'd like to explore Susha a little bit more, so I want to scroll down, way down to page 6, I think it is. I think one more page, maybe it's 7. Yeah, that's it. So, I see that one of my university friends and colleagues is with us today, who helped, who's in the field of Chinese economy, but she was nice enough to spend some time helping me work on this translation. So I want to thank Julie for that. And this is a poem Susha wrote that I think had a big influence on. Again, I don't know this specific poem had the direct influence on Dogen, but it had a big influence on the Zen writing and the thinking and the atmosphere that Dogen would have been in China and brought back to Japan. So getting up in the middle of the night aboard a boat. Now, Susha was known for writings about his boat rides, because after he fell out of favor in the government, he was only about 40 some years old, his mid 40s, I think. And he spent most of the rest of his life till he died in his 60s in a kind of exile. Sometimes it was a real punishing situation, and he was even imprisoned for a few years. And sometimes he was just kind of forced to travel around, kind of impoverished. He had a lot of prestige. His father was a famous poet. His brother was a famous poet. He came from Western Sichuan province, but became very successful in the eastern area along the coastline where the main cities were and the main literature was being written. And everybody honored his poetry, but there was very difficult political situations that caused him some problems. And so he, in China in those days, the exile would generally be to the south, to the so-called malarial south. And Susha, got swept up in that. And he was forced to go south from the capital. And he would often go on waterways and take these boat trips. And he doesn't, he's usually in the poems, he's not necessarily complaining about his situation, but if you look at the biography a little bit, you can see that atmosphere is there. So this one was written in the year 1079, and that was just at the time that his period of outcastness from the elite society was starting to begin. And he was sent on this one trip. And I'll read the first two, and I'll ask for somebody to read the third verse. As a light breeze rustles the reeds and cattails. I open the hatch to watch the rain, only to see that the lake is flooded by moonlight. Boatman and waterfowl alike have tumbled into sleep. A large fish, startled, scurries away like a fox fleeing. This late at night, people and things do not budge. Alone, I amuse myself with my own shadow. As the tide draws quietly on the shore, I feel sorry for cold earthworms. The moon setting amid the willows looks like a spider caught in a cobweb. So could I ask for somebody to do last verse?
Suddenly I am filled with a sense of disquiet and trepidation. The vivid scene passing right before my eyes must vanish in the blink of an eye. Cocks crow, bells resound, and birds chirp as they flutter away. The roar is echoed by a drum being struck at the boat's prow.
Okay, thank you. And if we look, if we could scroll down a little bit we look at the rest of the page. You can see there's a brief summary of some comments in English and Chinese on the meaning of the poem, and some examples like the scroll is an example of Susha's painting and inscribing poetry on the scroll. And he was known for being one of the first artists to create the kind of impressionistic or non-representational style that became very characteristic of Zen painting in China and Japan in subsequent generations. That conveys the state of mind of the artist more so than trying to depict the actual thing or the actual objects that are being painted. And Susha, in addition to his other accomplishments, is known for helping to initiate that process. And then, just to the left of that, there's a painting kind of imagining Susha in one of his boat rides. And Susha is also known as Su Dongpo, and Dongpo was a nickname because during his exile, one time he was forced to live in a very modest dwelling on the eastern slope of a mountain, and he took that as a nickname, Dongpo. And anyway, let's go back to the poem. You can see that summary refers to quietness and stillness and chilliness. So, any thoughts on the significance of the poem?
Well, what stands out to me is that he's amused by the own side of his shadow. And just in today's world, we're so preoccupied with all these different forms of entertainment, and that he's like skillful enough to just find entertainment and happiness just with something as simple as his own shadow. Stands out to me.
Yeah. That's a very good point. So he couldn't turn to his iPhone in that setting, but yes, and I think let's come back to that in a second. I think that's a very good point. If going back to the first verse, anything on the first verse, why does he wake up? And come out. So I think the point seems to be that he's asleep. He's inside a cabin.
Right.
He hears the sound of the rustling, and he thinks it must be raining. So he thinks he'll get up and watch the rain, and it's not raining at all. But there is a flood of light. So here's something. It's a kind of a very simple point in a way, but it shows the sense of deception, delusion, uncertainty.
Uh-huh.
We don't know what the sensations are really telling us. We could be completely wrong. We could be convinced for that moment that it must be raining, and then it turns out we're completely wrong. But we have to adjust our mind flexibly. We have to kind of do the pivot and deal with that. And his amusing himself with the shadow then is a perfect example of his ability to adjust to that situation because everybody else is asleep. but his presence also has an impact on the situation. And for example, the fish gets startled and flees away. So even though he's not trying to disturb anybody, and even though he may be a little bit, wish for company, and maybe feeling a little bit lonely, he finds a way to amuse himself. But the human presence cannot help but affect that natural surrounding, because the fish responds. But he's trying to let the stillness seep into himself. And so, yeah, that amusing myself. So what is a kind of turning point where he's turning inward? And how about the feeling sorry for the cold earthworms? Or the spider web. Any thoughts on those images?
Well, he becomes so open that he becomes, as we say, part of everything else, and suddenly has empathy for the earthworms. So his sense of self is wider.
Right. Good. So
also, the moon, conflating the moon with the spider caught in its own spider web is an extraordinary image. Spiders don't get caught in their own spider webs, and that seems to be the initiation of the sudden disquiet. This idea that getting caught up in the imagery can somehow bring them away from feeling at one with his surroundings and at one with the natural world.
Yeah, good. So it kind of moves very quickly there. So he's content, he amuses himself, and he has that contentment, but then he's aware that other beings, even the earthworms that you would, most people would ignore or be oblivious to, it heightens his attention to focus on that. And he does feel the solidarity with all sentient beings having Buddha nature on a certain level. But what does it mean other than feeling sorry for them? It must be a little bit frustrating. There's nothing you can really contribute to it. And then all of a sudden, yeah, he kind of gets lost here in a distraction, looking at the moon setting, and he's kind of so he's maybe that's part of the serenity, but maybe that's beginning to be aware that whatever he's looking at has that can't help but have a diluted element. And yeah.
May I offer a comment?
Yeah.
I feel like, based on your biography of him, that these mournful reflections are something about his own status at that time, where he is in the scheme of his society, and maybe one could say tinged with a lot of regret about whatever has brought him to such a pass. Because immediately after these observations, we see, suddenly I am filled with a sense of disquiet and trepidation. I mean, he's reflecting back on his own sense of loss, his wanderings in these humble circumstances. And the spider caught in a spider web, one could say, having had an exalted position, he is now brought into a web not of his own making.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of ingenious interpretation, I think, because I think you're right that's exactly what he and others would do. Is they couldn't directly complain about their fate and risk that would further aggravate the authorities that had turned against them, and so they find these very intricate ways of conveying that feeling, so that getting caught in the cobweb could mean referring to the socio-political the complications that you can't avoid, and that even though he feels this momentary serenity in the boat, whether it's raining or whether the flood is caused by rain or moonlight. He's able to use that as an opportunity to express himself in that regard. But so I think that's, that level is side by side with the level where, maybe if you don't know about the biography, you would just take it at face value that this is kind of an epic scene of attempting to commune with nature, being successful to some extent, and then not quite being able to complete that. Now, the impression we get from Keisai Sanshoku, if we mainly know about this poet from that passage, doesn't have all that complication and ambiguity in it. It's kind of a very triumphal proclamation of kind of understanding the unity of humans and nature. Okay, so in the final verse, we can see that it's that the sense of disquiet and trepidation comes up quite suddenly, and I think this second line is probably the main line for the whole verse, the vivid scene. And vivid, I think, could be translated in different ways. Beautiful scene, pure scene. Not sure the full implication, actually, but maybe it means that, just observing the scene.
Clearly perceived.
Perceived, yeah, that perception. You're taking that in. Now, it's vivid to him because he's attentive enough to think about the earthworms and the cobwebs. So he's not just looking out generally, but the scene itself isn't vivid. It's the perception that's vivid. Right before the eye, so the fourth character in that line is the gen of Shobo Genzo, the eye, which can imply the Dharma eye. But the scene is passing before him, but it passes, in the blink of an eye. It vanishes instantly. Again, there's other ways to translate that metaphor. So I guess the question would be, what exactly is causing disquiet and trepidation?
Well, perhaps partly the sense of loss, that all of this will vanish in the blink of an eye. And in the verse before, he has really been experiencing so much darkness of shadows and cobwebs and lowly earthworms. There's a sort of an existential angst here that I feel.
Yeah. So is that darkness? That's an interesting point. So in a way, though, don't you want to awaken from the darkness? Wouldn't you think that he might want to awaken from that darkness? So in any case, the dawn is coming. So there is a kind of an awakening. He's already awake, literally. And if he had an awakening experience in the Buddhist sense of beholding nature, observing it, having that detailed perception, seeing it, for what it is. Actually, there was a Japanese poet, now that I think about it, who had a famous line that says, I can talk about the beauty of the temple buildings, and I can talk about the beauty of the mountain. Can you talk about the beauty of the spider web? That attention to that fine attention to detail in the poetry and in some of the examples of that painting of that era, I think is one of the main things. But it's from the state of mind. It's not from actually trying to portray it in a representational way. So next thing that happens is that the sounds come about. Natural sounds, humanly created sounds, and the drum and the bell. Of course, the drum and the bell are associated with temple sounds because those would be two main instruments at the front gate of the temples traditionally that would be used for waking people up and for telling them other times of the day, for eating and meditation and chores. And that's happening on the boat as well. So is he kind of sacralizing those boat sounds? They're kind of ordinary sounds for the boat to make, but maybe he's bringing that into a kind of sacred quality. Okay, so let's look at the, yes,
if I
go
can
ahead.
comment very briefly.
Yeah, please.
I feel like in a way this entire poem is a process in which somebody might go through. Like in the beginning, he's getting that initial interest in the outside through the light breeze, and then he opens the hatch, and that's like the beginning process of getting through to enlightenment. And then he goes through the process of feeling that sorrow for the earthworms, and finally he kind of awakens in a way, and is able to see things kind of holistically. Like in the last two here, he doesn't use he's not talking about himself anymore. He's talking more about his surroundings. So yeah, that's kind of a way that I was interpreted it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So he does personalize in the first two verses and in the and in the beginning of the third verse, but then it's just like a description, which is a pretty typical Zen technique. And we'll see another example of that coming up, where the poetic observation concludes with a portrayal or a depiction of what's happening out there without necessarily referring. So even though, so if we talk about subjectivity and objectivity in Kyoto school of Japanese philosophy, where they're trying to interpret traditional Zen and kind of modern philosophical terminology, they often talk about pure subjectivity or absolute subjectivity, which means that you've embraced the objective world, you embrace the external reality, you embrace things as they are, so you made it so internalized by cultivating the perception, and the perception that you cultivate is going to have some delusions. And Dogen talks about making mistake after mistake until you make the right mistake. So some of the delusions for a human being are never going to be completely eliminated, but they can be incorporated into this absolute subjectivity. And the more absolute the subjectivity is, the more the description of objective reality is going to be emphasized rather than any reference to the subject. So I think, this last comment, and if we looked at it in terms of the the way the Kyoto school philosophers would look at a passage like this, I think that's, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, thank you for those comments. So let's go to the next one. And we'll come back to more Dogen, but the next one on the next page. And by the way, I think schedule-wise, we're gonna go to about 3, and then Bokushu is going to organize some breakout sessions for like 10 minutes or so, and then we'll take a half-hour break, and then we'll come back at like 3:40 or 3:45 for the final sessions. So just as you're thinking ahead. Okay, so this is another Song Dynasty Chinese poem that my colleague was graciously helped me with, by a poet named Huai Shen. Not nearly as well known as Susha is, and hasn't been translated very much, but was a very important player in this era. So if you figure Dogen is going to China in 1223, Huai Shen is writing this poem 100 or so years before him. Now, he was from the Yunmen school, or Unmon in Japanese pronunciation, which was one of the 5 schools that they talk about in Zen from this period. as you know, in Japan, it became mainly two schools, Rinzai and Soto. And the other schools had kind of died out or never really transitioned to Zen. You know, when we talk about the 5 schools of Zen in the Song Dynasty China, there was, in a way, it is true that the Rinzai school and the Soto school had become the most important in China as well. And there weren't really 5 that were active throughout the whole Song Dynasty. It was mainly those 2. But on the other hand, there were a lot of sub-factions. So when we talk about 5, you know, you might as well talk about 10, 15, 25 or more sub-factions, because each master had their own lineage and they had their own group and their own interpretation. And so it gets very interesting, but very complicated to track some of that history. But we do know that of the other schools, the Yunmen school was definitely the most popular of the 3, actually, for most of the 11th century. And that some of the initial writings, especially koans and koan interpretations, were primarily by Yunmen school. And then for various reasons, that kind of died out. And by the time Dogen got there, he would have only been aware probably of the 2 schools of Rinzai and Soto. As you know, Dogen, in some of his writings, one of the contradictions with Dogen is that in some of his writings, he denies having these sub-schools. And, you know, he doesn't really use the word Soto, you know, Soto. He says, I follow Rujing, I follow this lineage, but he said we shouldn't even use the word Zen necessarily. It's just true Buddhism. So all those things are very interesting and part of the ambivalences and the, kind of creative inconsistencies that make us think, you know, for me, make us think more deeply about what Dogen is getting at. Well, anyway, this poet wrote a famous poem called Taking a Step Back. And there's actually 12 stanzas. And I think here I have picked 6 or 7. I tried to streamline it a little bit. So how many are there? Anyway, it stops, on this one page. Anyway, there's 7 or 8 maybe. Okay, so we don't have to do all of them, but you can see that if you look at the first line, nothing is better than somebody who takes a step back. And so out of the original 12 verses, most of them start with that line. Here you can also see that they change it a little bit. Nothing is better than taking a step back to rest in the third one here and the fourth one. And if we scroll down a little bit, nothing is better than to take a step back to reside. Again, back to take a step back. And the last 2 are taking a step back to sleep. The common thing there is, nothing is better. If we look at the Chinese, it literally says 10,000 things. 10,000 things is, kind of a metaphor for everything. So you don't necessarily take it literally. But it says 10,000 things are not like. Literally, it says 10,000 things are not like. But I think I take it that this is kind of the implication. If we put it in contemporary translation, is it means like nothing is as good as taking the step back. And that's the implication through all of these, taking the step back, whether it's left as alone, that image, or whether it's to rest or to sleep, you take the step back. So my colleague and I were working on this when the quarantine first started back in the spring, maybe back in May, and we realized like, hey, this is exactly what's happening. This is an example of our Zen poet predecessors anticipating, in some ways, some of the things we go through today, like that comment about the line of amusing myself in the shadows. Okay, so Would somebody take that first verse?
Nothing is better. You're going?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Nothing is better than someone who takes a step back. Be sure to cultivate yourself thoroughly from head to toe, because when you blew out the flame burning in your heart, you no doubt missed seeing the anger that was in your belly.
Okay, good. Thank you. Any thoughts on this one?
Well, I can understand what he's saying, but from a contemporary psychological perspective, it's kind of amusing in the sense of, deadening the mind, but missing the passions that are still there. I mean, that's not what's intended I think historically, we think about when we take a step back, we're able to silence the anger that's in your belly. But I mean, of course, from a contemporary psychological perspective, we would say, that's shutting down something that's still present.
Okay, yeah. So are you saying it's different than the contemporary perspective, or?
I do think it's different. I think it's kind of, because when you blew out the flame burning in your heart, you no doubt missed seeing the anger that was in your belly. I think it implies that there's no more anger there, that you're not acting on the anger. And I was just saying that.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, because I tend to see it as and maybe it's the translation needs some tweaking, but I tend to see it as consistent with the contemporary view. I think what you're saying, if I understand what you're saying, which is that, in other words, you thought you had cleansed yourself, but if you didn't really take the step back from head to toe, you overlooked that core element that's going to continue to infect or pollute the situation. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly what I was trying to say. Yes.
Yeah. So I think
I think that's actually that can be quite a common experience among people practicing in general, is to feel like they've accomplished something or got somewhere, and then something comes back to bite them, and it's more lizard brainy, more fundamental, more embedded in you than you realize.
More embedded, exactly. Yeah.
Not dropped, basically.
So if we talk about dropping, like drop off body mind, you mean?
Yes.
And then Wu Xing's drop off. Like you have to continue to drop it off. You haven't totally dropped it off. I mean, I think of situations where, let's say you think to yourself, okay, I overreacted that time. I'm not going to overreact the next time. I got it straight. I know what I'm going to do. But then in the heat of that moment, there you are. If something's very frustrating or there's a sense of futility, and you realize, okay, yes, I still have that element there.
The delusion of non-delusion.
The delusion of non-delusion. That's a good
right. But the second line does say what you were saying. It tells us to be sure to cultivate thoroughly from head to toe, which would include the belly, the anger. Yeah. So it's an admonition. It's like, be careful there.
I'm struck.
I wanted to mention one thing. Good morning, Stephen. It's Marcia.
Oh, hey, how are you?
It seems to me what I get caught on is the stepping back, and the notion that that gives you a perspective on yourself, and what stepping back means in practice, as opposed to the view, so to speak. So I wonder if stepping back is really a legitimate way to get a perspective. That's a question.
Well, I mean, if I understand your question, that's a good point. I mean, I think of, in Fukan Zazengi and other writings, Dogen says, take the step back and let the light shine, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, and Dogen also uses, and I think especially in some Eihei Koloku passages, and And others in writings of that period would use the idea sometimes you advance, sometimes you step back. Sometimes you take a horizontal approach, sometimes a vertical approach. Sometimes you let go, sometimes you hold on. Those are all referring to teaching techniques, depending on the level of understanding of the disciple or the interaction that you're having. And so stepping back by itself would seem to be one-sided, because sometimes you have to advance. And stepping back could be too passive, or not dealing with the situation in and of itself. But I think, the way I take it is this author is trying to say, okay, let's explore that option in 12 instances, out of which I have 7 or 8 here. So let's explore what happens when you only take a step back. Now he says, and I think I have it here, let's, if we could scroll down a little bit, because he does talk about, there's a kind of price to pay. So let's look at the one where it says, nothing is better than stepping back to reside, at the top of the screen as it now appears. Nothing is better than stepping back to reside in a thatched hut hidden amid the green mountains. Others may laugh at this simple life, but I thoroughly enjoy my solitude. So I take that one to mean that there is a bit of price to pay, because others are going to laugh at me. If I look like I'm stepping back too much, people can say that you're disengaged. It's very easy to get criticized for this solitude. But an example would be that there's by having the solitude, you pay that price. And and so you're kind of free from the karmic residue of absorbing that criticism. And I think that theme comes up in the next verse as well. So would anybody take that one?
Sure, I'll read it. Nothing is better than a monk who takes a step back. With long hair and face unshaven, I spit out words like a country bumpkin. Who could help but listen to this blunt talk?
Okay, any thoughts on that one?
I identify with it.
How many identify with it in this group? No?
Unmute.
Well, who identifies?
Well, I'm struck from the previous poem or quatrain about the thatched hut. It immediately, for me, made me think of my several forays into leaving Facebook behind, say, for example. And kind of that feels like a version of fleeing into the mountains for a simpler life. And I really enjoyed that. My life felt richer and fuller for having set aside the kind of distractions and entanglements of social media. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, I've found myself thinking, and I find myself thinking it these days too, in a world of remote teaching as a professor as well, and remote learning and remote everything. Mm-hmm. that the circle of my life feels very small. I feel like I'm living in a thatched hut in some way right now.
Right. Yeah.
And so I wonder about usefulness, about being useful in the world, from my thatched hut. And yet what this second poem seems to be saying is that it's the monk in the thatched hut who actually has something to say.
Right.
So
the fool on the hill kind of idea.
How to bridge the monk in the thatched hut doesn't have Zoom. So how does he or she speak?
I also feel that there's an authenticity.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that what he's saying, I think, is also that there's an authenticity in stepping back. It's like giving up an idea of like what it is to be a monk, and just letting the hair grow and letting your face go unshaven, and just whatever comes out, and that's the truth. And so what? And when the truth is unvarnished, it can't but be something that's compelling to hear.
Right, right. So people have to pay attention. If the fool on the hill is speaking wisdom, and I think Ryokan, even though it's a rather later date, but at that point in Japanese society was still living that. There was a famous modern haiku poet, Santoka, who some of his works have been translated and kind of lived that way in the into the 20th century. So how do they get across if they don't have a platform like Zoom to communicate with? But I think I don't know. I mean, we need some social history there, but probably people their companions or their non-companions, but the people in neighboring areas would hear about them. They gain a certain reputation. They'd come to them for some insight. They'd get a following. I mean, one thing is that if these people are wise and they do wish to withdraw, they have to decide, do they want to teach or not teach? I mean, I think one thing what Dogen tried to do in a way was have his cake and eat it too by leaving Kyoto for the mountains. And so he had that sense of reclusion in nature and away from the secular socio-political pressures and the rivalries with other Buddhist schools and all that. But he chose to keep the responsibility of developing the community and establishing his Sangha at a time when these rules were still new. I mean, there had been Buddhist rules of discipline, but primarily for secluded monks, primarily for monks who followed certain rituals and doctrines. And he was trying to, he was newly establishing the Zen monastic discipline that had not been introduced into Japan before. I think the next one is interesting. Nothing is better than taking a step back to sleep, remaining at ease despite seeming inattentive or sluggish. Because sap is quite useful, we tap it from the tree, light a few drops of resin, and it burns through the night. So I had to look into this one a little bit, and I hadn't quite realized that sap had been used historically in Asia and other parts of the world as a fuel. And apparently it didn't take many drops to be effective, and the heat would last through the night, even with just a few drops. So the implication there is that that withdrawn country bumpkin monk who's plain speaking the truth, that people are probably paying attention to some extent, and maybe overly eagerly paying attention to without really trying to understand it, is like can compare himself, that a little bit goes a long way if it's the right, if it's on the right path, if it's an authentic, if it reflects an authentic realization. Yes.
Yeah, it seems, I had a quick question. So the way these are listed, it's chronologic, so to speak.
Well, again, there was 12 and I picked, 7 or 8, and that was the order, but I just left a couple out to squeeze them.
So I think what's interesting about these last two.
Yes, sequential. Yeah.
About the country bumpkin and then the resin is, what comes up for me is the question of aversion as opposed to, again, seeking out. And is there, in stepping back and in considering the idea of being unshaven, and yet one drop of knowledge, one drop of Dharma burns through the night. I mean, it seems to me like there's a recollecting that where he is in his stepping back allows him to see more clearly and burn more brightly, even on one drop.
Right.
I'm wondering what
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, even on the one drop, even, you know, if the teaching is authentic, if the practice is genuine.
And I think just going back to that question about how would we do it with or without Facebook or social media.
Yeah.
I mean, my sense about these personas was that you heard about them and you made the effort to seek them out.
Yeah.
And we do that now, and we can do that without social media.
Yeah, with or without it. I mean,
right.
Somehow that has been a tendency to seek out the wise people, because somehow the reputation grows because they're writing poetry, or because they're the activity is such that that people are learning from them or inspired by them.
Thank you.
So
can I say something?
Yes, please.
This verse gives me the sense that of creativity being in the unconscious, that without making an effort, you know, you seem inattentive or sluggish, but somehow, you know, this sap arises and emerges into the world and gives something to the world. And I kind of love that as a description of creativity, just within, but emerging.
Yeah. I mean, Dogen talks about constant effort, constant exertion, yoji, sustain, maintaining, the activity, the ji meaning literally walking, but implying practice in Buddhism. So it implies meditation. And, you know, meditation is a kind of active effort, but it seems to somebody else like you're doing nothing. You know, it also goes back to the Taoist, you know, wu wei, or non-action, that what looks inactive or inattentive is actually the most attentive. And, you know, that, I think that would apply to Susha. You know, that's what Susha was trying to get at, although he's kind of, as not a monk, he's kind of admitting that he's struggling with it at that time. And then we have all the biographical issues surrounding him as well.
Sorry, if I can make a brief comment. You know, now that you mentioned the comment with Susha and the importance of words, and the recipient of the country bumpkin's blunt talk, you know, he might not be able to understand everything completely. He might not be able to grasp everything completely. But if he gets a little bit of that, just a little bit of that sap, then that would be enough just for him to kind of access that that teaching. So
right.
That's kind of the way that I interpreted it.
Yes, good, very good. Yeah, the little bit goes a long way. And okay, so in the last verse, one thing I wanted to point out in the third line, well, let me just read it. Nothing is better than taking a step back to sleep. In a bed made of pine with a net of paper that feels as warm as a wool blanket, explaining dreamlike existence without resorting to flowery or coarse words. After all, I am just a rustic monk lacking knowledge of Zen. So one thing I wanted to point out in the third line, or to the left side of the second, you know, so, you know, if you read it across from left to right, line 1, line 2. So on our second line is kind of line 3 of the translation. And you, if you're familiar with the characters or in the English phrasing, it says in a dream, mu chu, like in the mu chu setsumu fascicle. And then the next, and that's in Japanese pronunciation. And then the next 3 characters are setsu wa mu. So, you know, Dogen has mu chu setsu mu. explaining a dream within a dream, or however, there's different translations of that. But you're in the dream and you're explaining the dream. And he also talks about you're in the world of entanglements and you're disentangling yourself from the entanglement in the Kato fascicle. And so this is a theme that Dogen has in several fascicles, making the right mistake of like, you're in the world of delusion and you're extricating yourself from the world of delusion, but you have to use the world of delusion in order to extricate from the delusion by seeing the delusion as delusion, but not getting into the delusion of non-delusion, to borrow the phrase that was mentioned a few minutes ago. So anyway, it occurs to me, that when we look at this, we can see how many of these ideas were kind of moving around in circles and being accessed and appropriated and interpreted and applied in different ways by the different Zen masters and poets in China, in Japan.
Could I ask you to comment, Dr. Heine, on this?
Yes.
What seems to be a poetic convention in the selections that we've read, these authors who have very distinguished histories, positions, even at the time they were recognized to be exceptional. Having this, I don't want to say pose, but they take the position that they are, country bumpkin, their efforts are worthless, lacking knowledge. It's consistently them trying to minimize their accomplishments themselves. How much of that was just a cultural expectation, independent of Zen at all? And is there any connection between that and the ambivalence about literature, which was at the time very much an upper class thing? So when you're coming from an upper class background, you're going to now be in an egalitarian framework of Zen, and maybe you have a certain amount of shame or ambivalence about your upper class origins.
That's a very interesting question, and I guess one implication maybe you're suggesting is is it a pose? Are you saying it's a kind of a literary conceit to pose as kind of humble and okay. So that's I really that's a deep question. I have to think about kind of historically and socially in that era. But yes, we do. If we go back to Dogen saying, my meager effort. I mean, that meager effort, that phrase when he says back on page 1, I regret my meager effort. I think that was, that was kind of a typical phrase to that he didn't invent that phrase. That's the kind of thing that they would say. Who am I? Who am I to express it? I'm just, I'm no different. So is that a conceit, a literary conceit to conceal, an egotistical, being conceited kind of thing? That gets, that's a very fascinating kind of question. So let me just I'm buying time here by repeating the question, but let me look at it from Dogen's point of view. And then we'll come back to some examples of Dogen. So Dogen, I think, had that very interesting background, supposedly, according to the traditional accounts, that on his father's side, the father was descended from an emperor from the 900s, and his father was a great military general, and his father was from the clan that was coming into power, beating out the Fujiwaras, and his mother was from the Fujiwara side, who had lost their prestige, but their aristocracy was still quite important when Dogen was born and through that whole 13th century, and had a big impact on Dogen's career one way or the other. And in fact, one theory is that would be that if you look at the traditional biographies, Dogen was supposedly offered by the Fujiwaras, who, when his mother and father died and he became an orphan at the age 7, apparently the mother's mother's father or the mother's brother. It's not clear which of the Fujiwaras, but took him in for a couple of years and trained him to have a social. He could have been one of the scholar elites. He could have been one of those people rather than a monk, and they wanted to train him. And he was supposed to have his confirmation ceremony at the age of 12, and then he snuck off and decided, no, I'm going to reject that, and he joins the Tendai monkhood on Mount Hiei, and then eventually gives that up and becomes a Zen monk, and the rest is history. But one theory would be is that that one of the reasons he would have left Kyoto is that the Fujiwaras were never happy with that, the fact that he rejected them, and that they supported other Zen teachers over him in Kyoto, and then he got the support of a samurai, Hatano, who happened to own land in the northern mountains, and he went off to the northern mountains. So just like Susha was struggling with a lot of these socio-political pressures, Dogen in his own way. I don't like to overplay that too much, but at least that's the way the traditional biographies create it. So he kind of comes down to earth from the aristocracy, but he deliberately abandoned it. He wasn't the only one who deliberately abandoned it, of course. But one thing that's a little bit different than Dogen is that a lot of the monks went into it at the high level, so they became elite monks because they were born into an elite family, or if they weren't born into an elite family, they were abandoned by their family, or their family could not support them, so they gave them to the temple, and then they kind of worked their way up from anonymity and gain prominence that way. So Dogen had a little of both. I think that's what's powerful about the Dogen story, is that he both has the kind of descending from the highest levels of society, and yet by purposely giving them up on his own choice at a young age, then he works himself up from the bottom up without any identity or support from the mainstream. And so, yes, he's always going to be kind of playing off of that vulnerability or making that comparison, I think. But yes, it also does play into the humility. I mean, I don't know how many have you are American sports fans out there, but there was a story that just happened this week where one of the great football quarterbacks, Aaron Rodgers, made some comment, and they said, "Oh, you're having a good year this year," and he goes like, "Even my bad years are better than everybody else's good years." And people were saying like, "Oh, you shouldn't say something. You're so egotistical." And then other people said, "Well, why not? If you got it, flaunt it. You're allowed to brag a little bit sometimes." And I think Dogen does have that bravado sometimes, because he says like, "I am the first in Japan to establish meditation. I am the first in Japan to establish Dharma Hall lectures. I am the first in Japan to give prestige to the chief cook, to the Tenzo. I am the first in Japan to establish the monastic rules of discipline." And there is that idea. If we go back to the Zen teachers supposed to startle their assembly with the brilliance of their words, and they overturn the oceans and leap over Mount Sumeru. Dogen has that proclamation, those kinds of proclamations as well. So I think it's disingenuous. He's not trying to build himself up on an ego trip necessarily, but there's a combination of those factors, of the total humility in some cases, and I'm no better than anybody else, and then saying, no, here's where I'm a pioneer, here's where I do establish it. And I think actually those claims that Dogen make, if you look at them, and they're mostly not in Shobogenzo so much as in the Eihei Koloku, some Eihei Koloku passages, I think they're very important, because the fact of the matter is he was the first to do a lot of that stuff, and it got taken for granted very easily. And then the Rinzai school historically kind of became more popular or more prestigious than the Soto school did for a while, partly because they did keep the connections with the Fujiwaras and the aristocrats. And so there's a lot of that I do interpret there's a lot of that in the background. Okay, as we're heading towards the breakout and then the break time, let's move back, if we could, if you don't mind, scrolling up to the first page again, or second page, I think. top of the second page. Okay. Okay, this is from the author of the Blue Cliff Record, and in the which has 100 cases, and in case 100, and in some versions it's actually in case 99. They get there's some disagreement about whether it's 99 or 100, but anyway, towards the end, at the end of the book, after commenting extensively on 100 koan cases, and I do think the Blue Cliff Record, which is something that I've been very fascinated by, especially in recent years. I do think the Blue Cliff Record, it's very complicated what Dogen's relationship with the Blue Cliff Record was. I won't go into all the details about that, but I do think the Blue Cliff Record, you know, again, I say this to my students sometimes, like if you're gonna read Dogen, think about like, what's the one thing that you have to read first before you can really understand Dogen? And of course, there's a lot of things, and you could pick 9 things, and there might be things in Western philosophy or in Christianity that, you know, Christian mysticism, or something very different that you know makes you ready to really appreciate reading Dogen. But for me, it's the Blue Cliff Record, because Dogen takes so much of his, so many of his ideas, so many of his basic terminologies, like Zenki, total dynamism or activity, Genjo Koan, and many other examples. I think of Kato, the entanglements, he was really inspired. Not that he's imitating it, but he a lot of his vocabulary and syntax and the way he frames things is very much related to Blue Cliff Record. And of course, there is the very good translation going back to the 1970s by the Cleary brothers. So at the end, he says, filled with countless bushels, a boat effortlessly pulls away, holding just 1 grain of rice in a jar, entraps a snake. When offering comments on 100 transformative old koan cases, just how many people end up with sand tossed in their eyes? So let's look at that last line. What does he mean by sand tossed in their eyes?
I think this really ties to what we were just talking about. He's casting a sort of aspersion on his own verses and saying that they would actually be an impediment to clear sight and clear insight into the cases.
Right. And would that be true for all language? Yeah. I mean, there's where we get the implication, and that, you know, as some of you know, Blue Cliff Record's kind of complicated, and this guy Yuenmu's commenting on Xuedou, who was a century before him, and he says, you know, everything I say and the other masters say is like tossing sand and sprinkling mud. So this, you know, is the ultimate statement of humility. But let's go down to the third one where it says ambivalent self-responsibility. So if we look at these next two, one is by this guy Xuedou, who you know, was one of the 2 main contributors to Blue Cliff Record. They lived a century apart. So Yuenmu comments on Xuedou. In one act, he takes the tiger's head and the tiger's tail. His imposing majesty extends throughout the 400 realms. So in commenting on a koan, he refers to a master's majesty that can tame the tiger. Yunmen, but I inquire of him, didn't you realize how impregnable the position was? In other words, whatever great thing you did, I can still challenge it. I can still say you're going to be a loser next time around, you know, kind of tongue in cheek. But then, you know, this is what I like the best about this. The final part, the final line is, and if you see, you can see in the Chinese, there's 7 characters, but the last one only has 5 characters. And the first 2 characters says, Xuedou says. I leave out the last part. So he doesn't finish this poem. Why would he not finish that poem?
If I may, in a way, I see it that the position, my interpretation is, I don't know if it's wrong or not, but the way that they see the use of words is that it depends on the recipient, and they have to be able to kind of see it with, I guess, their mind's eye. Any kind of word can be useful as long as they're able to interpret it correctly. And I think it goes back to the idea of nature as well. Nature is there to show us that everything is imbued with the Buddha nature, but unless we're able to actually see it, then, it's not of much use to us.
Right. So, I mean, so there's a couple points I think you made. One point is that it's in the mind's eye. And ultimately, and Dogen will say this as well, is that these great interpreters will say, look, I can only go so far. I mean, you have to express it for yourself. And don't expect me to rehash what others have said. Don't expect me to rehash what I myself have said previously. I want to always say it somehow new, in a new way, and not get stuck on a fixed position. So going back to the original point, Zazen is steadfast. The speaking is flexible, but the flexibility comes from the steadfastness. It's, without, that's the goal that Dogen, I think, is trying to reach, is to integrate that flexibility of discourse. And these are, this is not Dogen, but this is an example that would have influenced him.
Not clinging.
Go ahead.
The not clinging.
Not clinging. Yeah.
Don't hold on. Go with it. Find it for yourself.
Find it for yourself. Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, I'm throwing sand in your eyes. So if you want to take the sand out of your eyes, you say it yourself, and you become your own teacher. You become your own recluse. You become your own. My teaching is only there to help you to develop your teaching, which is there to help the next person in the, the network, in the Dharma network. Or maybe network's too modern a word, in the Indra's net of the Dharma. Also, the next one is from the Gateless Gate, or the Mumonkan. This is so similar. On this case, the verse comment, lifting his leg, he kicks up the scented ocean, lowering his head. He looks down from the fourth dhyana heaven. So these are those examples of boasting, of bravado, of, where we, using these physical imagery to say how great the master is. But then the last line is, let someone else complete that verse. So I lately I've been, looking at these two side by side. I just love the way they just trail off there. And in the Chinese on this one, again, you see it's 7, 7, 7, 7, and the last one only has 5, because it just says, someone else will follow up. And, in fact, they did have, what in Japan were called verse contests, where the great poets, and some of them were monks and some maybe weren't monks, but they were probably all meeting together at some point. And in the era after Dogen, 100 years after Dogen, the shoguns became very involved with Zen and supported, and had what could be called salons in the imperial palace in Kyoto, where they brought in the great poets and artists and the Zen masters, and the famous painting of by Josetsu's, with how do you catch a catfish with a gourd, where there were 33 poems written about that one painting. It was an example of that atmosphere. We don't know if Dogen was part of that kind of atmosphere, but when he was in Kyoto, before he went to Eihei, and you figure when he comes back from China, he's in Kyoto for like 15 years. And, we don't know. We can only speculate. How did he get along with the Fujiwara clan? How did he, you know, what happened here and there. But there are a couple of indications based on some letters that have been recovered and some other documents that he may have been involved in that poetic world a little bit, and he may have communicated with those people, and he may have participated in some of those poetry contests where they'd have, let's say, a dozen poets sitting around, and one writes the first half of the verse and the other has to complete it. And then the next one has to start a new verse, and that's completed by the fourth person. Okay, so before we do the breakout, let's finish with one. Let's go back to Dogen, back on page 1.
Sounds like rap.
Stephen, at some point, can you speak to the word impregnable?
Yeah. Yeah, when I read it, I was thinking, like, why did I use that word? So let me do that after the break, okay? So we're about to take the break, and let me double check that. You read my mind. Okay. So here's, you know, this could be my favorite Dogen poem. Ambivalence Mission, the one under the one that we read about the meager efforts. And you know, some of these, when you look at the textual history, it gets complicated because there were different versions of these. And this was one of the first poems of Dogen translated to English by Lucian Strick. A lot of people still know this translation. I forget the title of that book, but he had a translation of some Zen poetry, including this one by Dogen. And he was using a little bit different version from the original writing for his translation. So it reads somewhat differently. And he has this phrase, dream walkers. And he also uses this phrase, black rain on the roof of the temple. And I think what he really means is evening rain. So I disagree a little bit with the black rain, especially in the modern times, because that was a term for the Hiroshima bomb. But anyway, that is a poetic translation by Lucian Strick. But if you just look this over for a minute, since we're trying to go to the break time or the breakout time. So let's let me ask, what is the message from the last sentence, last line of this poem?
Well, when I read that line, it makes me think of Rikyu and the tea house and that tremendous sense of peace. I mean, how much better can it get?
Right.
That's the thought I have.
Yeah. Good. The reason I added the word deep grass is because Fukakusa, where Dogen was living in a hut at that time, literally means deep grass. And it was outside of Kyoto, but it was mainly a place for the aristocrats to go and, get a getaway from the city by going, and be, grassy hills and cool streams. Of course, in modern Kyoto, that Fukakusa neighborhood is a very congested modern neighborhood, and you have to go further out to get to the countryside. But in Dogen's era, this was like in the countryside, and he says, like, okay, I'm dealing with the big issues: life and death, delusion and enlightenment, dream and reality. But let me just sit and listen to the rain. Yeah, and that let's just be overwhelmed by that calming effect. Of course, the rain itself, if it's pouring in a grass hut, and the grass is deep, I mean, that can be a little disturbing because it can be overwhelming challenge maybe to deal with that. But at the same time, it's very comforting. It's the quietude. It's the darkness in the sense of the mystery of the Dharma, and we just relinquish it. And that's the refrain that we see from a number of these kinds of poems, where in the end, you just go to the simple depiction of nature.
I got the idea that it was going back to nothing is better than taking a step back. It's that same refrain. He in this poem by Dogen, he loses his way, and maybe some of that losing the way is what we've seen in earlier poems, where there's that bit of braggadocio or sort of announcing their one's attainment. And I was feeling that personally. Last night, I felt I was writing something really important that was going to get Trump out of office. No, I was writing something important to me, but then I felt compelled to watch the basketball game. The step away.
And Miami won.
Yeah, great. I think so. And so it's the taking. He moves back. I think a lot of what we've been reading today is making an important proposition and then moving back. And everything is an interlude. You're doing one thing, you take the step back, and nothing's better than that, than pulling away and going into the grass hut.
Okay.
I have another take on it. He's in the moment, listening to the rain, even though he's still within the self-constructed structure of self, but he's aware, deep in the grass of his hut. Both the depth of what's around him and his own structure that he has constructed.